to Season 3 of HistoHelp, a podcast series with tips, tricks, and solutions to the common and not so common problems in the lab. In this season, we're going to expand on your tech knowledge, talk about a polar bear, and figure out some interesting training ideas for hard tissue. Thanks for listening, and enjoy! Welcome to part 1 of this 2-part AI in the Lab HistoHelp. This episode is going to feature once again our NSH podcast expert and AI advocate, David Krull, as well as Adam Smith from Indica Labs. Dave and Adam are going to talk about validation when it comes to AI technology, data collection, as well as Adam sharing his 3 approaches to ways that a person who's interested in implementing AI technology can easily do so. Here's David Krull.
So I thought I'd start out by talking a little bit about my background. So I have a lot of experience in research. So I was at Pfizer, and then I moved to GSK. So I have about 30 years total in the research setting. And I know quite a few of our listeners will have some research background, but the majority will likely be from clinical diagnostic labs. So we're hopefully going to cover information that would be applicable to people in research, as well as the clinical histotechnology and diagnostics. So I'm going to start just asking a few questions, Adam. Maybe you could first tell us a little bit about how you got involved in digital pathology and histology by sharing a little bit about your background and what brought you to where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dave. So yeah, I started out my career in the labs at Merck in the safety assessment group there. And that was probably about a year or two in. So I was doing everything from necropsy up through staining and sort of everything in between there in the process. And had a lab meeting where they introduced this digital whole slide scanner, and they kind of touted it as where the field was going, and it was a great opportunity, especially in safety assessment and in toxicology, to hopefully increase the throughput. And really one of the main drivers when they brought that on board was the hope that artificial intelligence would be able to help the tox paths really sort of whittle down their workflow. You think about sort of the large scale of the slides that come through their labs, especially for like a carso study. And then 90+% of those slides are not remarkable, just totally normal everyday slide, and they're searching for those needles in the haystack. And so the initial goal when they brought everything on was to use artificial intelligence to screen these slides, look for abnormal versus normal, sort of flag the abnormal slides. And that's where they could spend their time, is sort of focus on what exactly is this? Is it drug related? What's going on there? And that was the goal and the intent. And that's back probably like 06 or so, 07.
Wow. Okay.
And so I kind of got involved on that end, with the scanners and working in the labs, prepping slides and things like that. And then eventually moved into image analysis, really took to it and enjoyed it as sort of the favorite part of the workflow there for me. And then kind of parlayed that into a job at Indica Labs, where I was actually a customer of Indica's, working at Merck. Really liked the software, liked the company, and then sort of transitioned over where I now got to do image analysis as a full-time job. So I really like being able to come back, especially with an audience like NSH, where it's almost all primarily end users in the lab, really similar background and sort of career path that I was on, and being able to sort of be in a familiar audience and talking to everyone. So a lot of the things that I wish I knew at the time, I like to try to bring that along as well, and pass that along when I can. So
experience is our best teacher, right? We learn by doing and making mistakes and trying over again. And so I'm sure you bring a lot of that to your current role.
Absolutely. I try to pass that along, help people sort of avoid some of those pitfalls along the way. So
I just want to go back to something that you had mentioned. So 2006, that's almost unbelievable, because that's way before I was even thinking about artificial intelligence. And here you were actually using that at Merck to really try to identify abnormal. Is that what you're saying, from H&E sections maybe?
Yeah, so there was the company, it was SPC, I think it was Systems Pathology company, corporation. It's a little foggy at this point, 15 years later.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And it was Gary Knutson, who's a vet path,
Oh,
was
okay.
running the company, and they had a software called CAPS, and that was the intent was to be able to screen it. And so they had several groups, that were sort of working through the proof of concept studies and working through the software, and then uh, eventually I think it was purchased by Charles River, and then kind of was shelved at the time. And I think the reasons it kind of got shelved was that from a technology perspective, the computing power
Mm,
needed to undertake something like that. You think again about the scale of tox studies and just hundreds and hundreds of slides coming
that's right.
through
Yeah.
that it's screening. The analysis times and working through that hardware wise in 2006, networking wise, within a company to have the pipeline to move all that through. I don't think it was quite there yet. So I think it was a little bit ahead of its time.
Okay.
And so now, 15 years later, we're still seeing, the processing power, the computers and the hardware is really the limitation for a lot of labs to implement that. And so looking at GPU processing, and it's becoming more and more accessible, but that's still one of the major hurdles. So going back again, 15 years ago, it was a wall and not a hurdle at that point,
Hmm.
and for really slowing people down. So it was interesting. A few months back, I was sort of looking through some old agendas for the DPA conference, Pathology Visions,
Yeah.
and that's where I found that the '07 agenda had a talk from Gary on there, and the agenda as a whole had a lot of AI on there, and it was pretty incredible to me to see. These talks at the time. If you look at that agenda just at face value, it looks like, man, problem solved. Like it looks like we haven't done anything in the past 15 years. Um, because everything was there, and the ideas. So I think the hardware and the technology has started to catch up now, where I think it's become much more accessible to labs. You could run it on an individual tower. You don't need sort of this massive processing and some of the capabilities that you probably would have needed at the time to successfully implement that sort of
Yeah.
thing.
And you mentioned that example about screening, diseased versus normal or off-target issues involved with safety studies. And now I guess we've seen a real mixture of different applications for artificial intelligence. So now that we have more advanced immunohistochemistry techniques where we can label proteins and things like RNA-scope, where we're actually detecting mRNA transcripts in tissue samples. How are you seeing the AI being adapted to meet those needs? Uh,
Yeah, absolutely. So there's sort of two segments of AI that we see out there. The first is going to be more on the data side of things. So taking that multiplex data that you're getting out of there, correlating that with patient or specimen data, and trying to dig through and figure out where the trends are. So if you have, I don't know, 10 markers on a slide, and you're trying to piece out, which 2 or 3 of those at a certain intensity, where's the connection between effect or no effect, or responding, not responding, all those sorts of endpoints. And that's really not the realm where we deal, but it
okay.
is AI nonetheless. You're teaching the
Yeah.
computer, and then the computer's going through and trying to find those connections. The other piece of it is more on the tissue segmentation side of things. So segmenting tumor from non-tumor, segmenting cells has become more common recently. Segmenting nuclei. Then most recently, we've sort of merged our traditional halo analyses, cell counting, cell phenotyping through intensity of those markers, and combine that with the AI nuclear segmentation. So you're able to take sort of more challenging tissue types, so things like GI sections where the epithelium
Mm.
really have just some packed in cell populations, and get some better segmentation based on that AI nuclear segmentation. So really the tissue segmentation piece has been the big one for us. So whether it is directly looking at the stain sections and sort of getting some segmentation there, or taking the information from the stains, the multiplex sections, and applying that to H&Es. And so being able to kind of define the tumor population in an H&E based on training data that comes from an H&E and an IHC stained image. So sort of in the same training set. So that's something that using sort of more simplistic machine learning or AI methods, like a random forest algorithm, you couldn't do that. You couldn't take H&E images and train a network along with IHC images. That would sort of just, everything would break down because it was based solely on color and texture. But with the AI networks, it's using a lot more contextual information and size and things like that to develop sort of a more robust segmentation across multiple staining modalities.
Okay. And this can, by somebody that hasn't really done any work in AI or artificial intelligence or image analysis, how approachable is this technology? How much training do people really need to do this? Because it sounds like it could be pretty complex for some labs to do it.
Yeah, it does sound like that at face value. And there's really 3 different approaches that we've seen so far to kind of bring that to folks in the lab. One of them is sort of the more CRO approach, where there are companies and vendors and ourselves included that you can bring them a data set and say, this is what we want to accomplish, go do it and get back to us with a trained segmentation. So that's sort of one option and sort of one model that's available. The other is going to be sort of, I'd say more of like a web-based model, where those networks and things are sort of pre-built, ready to go, and then you're submitting your test set, and it's more of like a per-click type of model. So again, the work is sort of already done ahead of time in that training piece. And then the third and sort of the option that we provide is going to be allowing users to basically use pretty simple drawing tools, circle areas, outline areas for the training data, and supply that to the networks for training. And so while the math on the back end is way over my head and totally out of my realm of expertise, on the user side of things, it's actually pretty straightforward, where either the pathologist can select those regions, specify what that is. The technician can then select them depending on the complexity and what you're trying to segment. I'm far from a pathologist, and at this point I can find glomeruli on a kidney image and circle them and provide them to a network to train. Right.
Nice.
So depending on the application, it can be a wide range of expertise sort of on what you're circling, but the basic process of drawing, outlining an area and supplying that to the network is pretty accessible and pretty straightforward on that front.
Yeah, well, you made me think back to a very early image analysis, I'll put in quotes, because it was very manual. It wasn't software at all. I was actually doing an evaluation of some rat liver that was actually treated with a compound. And my very first immunostain was PCNA. It was the PC10 clone, and it was just the regular DAB IHC method that was run manually. And I had to use a microscope and with a reticule and go around and count a number of high power fields, and then count all the PCNA positive cells within those fields. And they had a little clicker that I used to count those. And so that was my first study doing quantitative IHC expression based on cell counts. And I'm thinking back at the time, I didn't even count the non-positive ones either. I was just counting the absolute value per field, which didn't take into account the number of negative nuclei. And now I think how image analysis, now you can count all of the nuclei and then actually segment on the size and the shape of the nuclei. So we have so much more power there. So maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean that's really one of the benefits of image analysis, whether it's AI based or not, is the ability to really raise that N and get that bigger sample size, where maybe it de-emphasizes the overall accuracy a bit, but what it replaces with is the consistency of that count's going to be the same Friday morning as it is Tuesday afternoon.
Right.
And if that cell's positive, it's always positive. So I'm sure in that mode where you're going through with the clicker and trying to keep track, there's some cells that are like that borderline of is that positive, is it not positive, and that answer could change whether if Dave's counting, if Adam's counting, whoever's counting, that could change, and then the time of day, things like that, that can really move, and with image analysis it doesn't. So you're upping that end, and so statistically, that maybe some of the areas where it's not as accurate, statistically it's not making a difference because you're now counting 1 million cells in a section, which I don't know what your average sample size was with the clicker, but I'm assuming it was maybe per 100 cells or something like that, where it's not in the tens of thousands or millions
That's
of
right.
sections. And so you start thinking about the scale of that, to take a whole slide section, count all of the cells, positive cells, and now you do that on 100 more images, you end up with a really strong data set. That it's easy, I think, when you're sort of setting up some of these assays and algorithms, to get kind of micro focused on a small area, and oh, you know what, it's missing that cell, and
that's right.
we need to get that right, and you spend some time getting that right, and then you jump to another field of view, and now it's missing something else, and you got to try to tweak that. But the reality of it is that when you count those million cells, that difference between whether that one was counted or not, it really doesn't make a difference statistically. It's more about getting that fat part of the bell curve right, and and then having a really strong data set based on the sheer volume of data that you're going through.
I'm not sure where I got the phrase from, but I've heard somebody say, what is it? Count more or less well. So you increase the number of cells that you're counting, but you don't have to worry about as being as accurate because you're raising your N.
Yeah, I had the good fortune to work with a biostatistician on some studies when I was at Merck, and it was pretty eye-opening to see the way that he then approached the data and what was important, and really leveraging that expertise to narrow down the sample size. And okay, well, how many sections do you take from this specimen? So if you take 3 slices from this block, what does that do to your N and to the overall data versus 2 slices? And if you have 3 pieces of tissue on the same slide, from different parts of that organ, that the difference between those sections versus the difference between the slides, and really just going through all those different tests to ultimately come up with a strategy for that specific assay, to give you the best data. And so that idea of sampling more less well is definitely an accurate summary of it.
Yeah, you brought in something else, that I think is important for the listeners to know, and that's you have to reach out and design to others to help design the appropriate study to get the end. So again, begin with the end in mind. So what questions do you want to answer, and how do you plan to do that? And then get the right people around the table to design the study that can answer those questions. And sometimes it does mean bring in a statistician to do that as well, to help do those power calculations, so you can have a good idea on what to measure and how to measure those things. And we also want to be responsible and efficient in the work that we do too, especially with human samples and animals. We want to be very cognizant of the resource that we have, and not use more than what is necessary to answer the question. So those are all things that are very important. The other thing that comes up quite a bit is around the validation. Like, how do you validate these methods, and what is actually the ground truth? We know that humans make mistakes, and they can be fallible, but it seems like people are more open in general to accept somebody's visual observations and counts over a count from the software. And actually the software should be doing a better job, right? If it's well set up and configured, versus a person who, like you said earlier, could be tired that particular day, or maybe not be having a good day, could be rushing to get through something, or could be a Friday afternoon, they're just trying to catch up on some studies that they need to do before taken off for the weekend. So there can be more variabilities versus a software package that has been finely tuned to do that type of image analysis. And then you just let it run overnight or across the day while you apply your skills to something else, and you allow the software to do what it needs to do. So maybe you could comment a little bit about your approach to validation or what you see other groups doing with respect to that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pretty common question that comes up to us, especially with AI as we're looking at the volume of training data. It's a pretty common question, like, well, how big does the training set need to be, or how many images do I need? And the answer, or the non-answer, unfortunately, is that it depends.
It depends.
It depends on your study,
Yep.
your assay, the sensitivity of it, and so on. And so what we try to do is provide some additional evidence to help you in the validation.
Okay.
And again, everyone's tolerance is going to be different too, of what's the right percentage of accuracy. Is it 90? Is it 80? What percentage is that for everyone? So it can vary. But so what we do is we try to provide some endpoints. So in AI, we use cross entropy as a value that's computed, that's giving you a clue that your network is heading in the right direction. But so cross entropy is a measure of what the computer is learning versus what you've given it as training data. So it's sort of comparing it to the ground truth that you've given it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, where that could be misleading is if you have given it poor training data, right?
Okay.
So if I tell the computer that these are all pictures of cats, but in reality, they're actually pictures of dogs, right? The computer can get really good at identifying what it thinks is a cat, and it's telling you, I've got this down, this is perfect. But in reality, it doesn't know anything because you've given it bad data. So that cross entropy can be low. And so in addition to that, then we have some visualizations that we use to allow you to see in real time what the data would look like. So you get some real time feedback for a field of view of sort of what that segmentation would look like, what the cell segmentation, things like that. And that allows you to then take that cross entropy value. So you have a low value, you're then by eye validating that and saying, yeah, that looks right. The cross entropy value is low, so that's starting to give you more and more confidence that you're about to hit that point of validation. And then I think looking at multiple fields, multiple specimens, sort of the high ends and low ends of intensity, because we know that can vary as well, and sort of looking at trying to get a nice cross section of your data set as part of the validation. So unfortunately, there's no sort of hard fast number, but sort of using all of those clues and then applying it to that cross section should really start to point you in that direction of getting to a point where you feel confident in the accuracy of that network and of your training data, and you're able to apply that to a larger set.
Yeah, that's a really good example, and I like your analogy about cats versus dogs. We need to be really confident that we're teaching the software to identify the correct objects, right? If we're telling it to identify the wrong thing, then it's only going to be as good as the person that was training the software, right? The AI approach, and that goes back to even a little bit more downstream of that is really making sure that we have the appropriate assay. So a lot of labs are using these new antibodies that are coming on the market, and they need to do their own assay validation to make sure that their antibodies are validated and they are confident that it's labeling the appropriate target. And as we're getting more involved into multiplexing, that's even more important to look at those different combinations.
Yeah, that's I think that covers it.
Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you have a tip, trick, or piece of knowledge you'd like to share, let us know. We would love to feature you on a future episode of HistoHelp. Have a great day!